It was supposed to be just another quick stop on our road trip. We were tired, having driven for hours on that deserted highway, and the only place that showed up was an abandoned motel. The facade was completely run down, with a rusted sign creaking in the wind, and the parking lot asphalt was cracked, overgrown with weeds everywhere. My friends, Luke and Carla, thought it would be a good idea to explore the place since we were too exhausted to keep driving that night. I wasn't really into it, but I ended giving in. Little did we know what we were about to find inside. When we walked into the first room, the vibe was off from the start. The smell of mold was strong, and the air felt heavy, as if time had stopped there decades ago. But what caught my attention the most was how things seemed to have been left behind in a hurry. There was an open suitcase on the floor, clothes scattered on the bed, and even a shoe tossed in the corner, as if someone had bolted out and never returned. Carla joked that it looked like a scene from a horror movie, but you could tell she was uneasy. We kept exploring, and every room was the same, personal belongings abandoned, as if the people had just vanished into thin air. When we reached the last room at the end of the hallway, things got really weird. The door was slightly ajar, and the inside was even more chaotic than the others. Clothes thrown on the floor, a desk flipped over, and a shattered mirror in the bathroom. But what made the hair on my arms stand up was the sound. Faint, almost imperceptible, there was the ring of a telephone. We froze, staring at each other, unsure of what to do. Luke was the first to move, following the sound to an old phone on the nightstand. He glanced at us, hesitated, and then picked it up. For a second, there was nothing. Just static. And then, deep in the background, you could hear breathing. Slow, heavy, as if someone was on the other end, just waiting. Carla took a step back and told us to get out of there. I didn't need her to say it twice. We bolted out of the room, but before leaving the motel, I glanced at the parking lot through the broken reception window. That's when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks, fresh tire marks on the asphalt. They were clear, as if a car had passed by just minutes ago. But we hadn't heard anything, and we hadn't seen anyone around since we arrived. Luke insisted it was all in our heads, but I wasn't convinced. Something about that night was very, very wrong. We decided to get out of there as fast as we could, but the car just wouldn't start. The engine kept sputtering, and I could feel cold sweat forming on my forehead. Luke kept trying while Carla and I looked around, half expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the darkness. The parking lot was lit only by the faint glow of the moon, and the silence was so thick you could hear the wind rustling the dry leaves on the ground. Suddenly, Carla jumped and pointed behind me. When I turned, I almost fell backward. The light in one of the motel rooms had turned on by itself. It was a dim flicker, like an old bulb being switched on, but it was enough to send us into a panic. Luke finally got the car to start, and we sped off like crazy. I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us, but there was only the dark road and the motel fading into the distance. Carla tried to brush it off as coincidence, saying we must have imagined things because we were tired, but I wasn't buying it. And neither was she, judging by how often she kept glancing back. We drove in silence for a while until Luke decided to pull into a gas station to calm down. That's when Carla realized she'd left her bag at the motel. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Her bag had everything, wallet, phone, even her house keys. We couldn't just ignore it and keep driving. Luke suggested we go back in the morning when it was light out, but Carla insisted she couldn't wait. She was on the verge of panic, and I couldn't blame her. After some arguing, we gave in and decided to head back to the motel. I didn't want to, but I wasn't going to let them go alone. The drive back was tense, no one said a word, just the sound of the engine cutting through the night silence. When we got there, the motel looked even creepier than before. The light in the room that had turned on earlier was off again, and the parking lot was still empty. Carla ran straight to the room we'd been in, while Luke and I stayed outside, keeping watch. I couldn't take my eyes off that window where the light had turned on, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. Carla took a while, and when she came out, she was pale as a ghost. She said she'd found her bag, but the phone was ringing again. This time, she didn't answer, but she said the breathing on the other end sounded louder, closer. We didn't wait around, just got in the car and drove off as fast as we could. This time, the car started right up, as if even it wanted to get away from that place. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. We found a 24-hour gas station and decided to spend the rest of the night there, far from that road and the motel. No one talked much, each of us trying to process what had happened. Carla kept fiddling with her phone, probably trying to distract herself, while Luke stared into space with an expression I'd never seen on him before. I couldn't stop thinking about that breathing on the phone and the fresh tire marks. Someone had been there, but who? And why didn't they show themselves? When morning came, we decided to keep driving and never talk about it again. But ever since then, strange things started happening. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, my phone rings with an unknown number, and when I answer, it's just static and that same heavy breathing. I've tried blocking the numbers, but they always change. Luke said he's been getting calls like that too, but Carla denies it, saying she doesn't even want to think about it. I don't know what happened at that motel, or why we ended up there, but one thing's for sure, that night changed something in us, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget. Months have passed since that night, and we've never really hung out like we used to. Luke moved to another city, saying he needed a fresh start, and Carla seems to have buried the experience deep in her mind, avoiding any topic that reminds her of the motel. Me? I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I get the feeling that I'm being followed. I've looked in the rearview mirror and sworn I saw headlights behind me, but when I stop to check, there's no one there. And the calls, they haven't stopped. Always at the same time, always with the same static and the same breathing. I've tried tracing the numbers, but it never leads anywhere. It's like it's haunting me, as if I brought something back from that place. To this day, I can't explain what happened at that motel. I've searched online, tried to find stories from other people who might have experienced something similar, but I've found nothing. It's like that place doesn't exist, or never existed. And the worst part is, sometimes I catch myself thinking about going back there, just to try to understand. But then I remember that breathing on the phone, the fresh tire marks, and the light that turned on by itself, and I give up. Some things are better left behind, even if you can never forget them. And this is one of them. It was a Sunday afternoon, and we were just out for a drive with no particular destination in mind. Me, Anna, Peter, and Julia were tired of the daily grind and decided to explore some places outside the city. That's when we saw that church in the middle of a field. It looked like it had come straight out of an old movie. The stone walls were covered in ivy, the roof was partially collapsed, and the bell tower was crooked, as if it were about to fall over. Anna, who's always been the most curious of the group, insisted we stop to check it out. I wasn't really into it, but I gave in. Little did we know what we were about to find inside. When we walked in, the air was heavy, with a strong smell of old incense, like someone had burned it just minutes ago. The pews were all overturned, some broken, and hymnals were scattered across the floor, as if there had been some kind of commotion. Julia even joked that it looked like the church had been abandoned in the middle of a service. We started exploring, kind of awkwardly, until we heard something that made us freeze, a faint singing, like a choir. The music was soft, almost beautiful, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. Anna looked at us and said, "You guys hear that too, right?" We stood there, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the church itself was singing. Peter, who's always been the skeptic of the group, tried to say it was just the wind hitting something, but you could tell he was uneasy. The music was too clear to be just that. Anna decided to follow the sound, walking up to the altar, while Julia and I stayed near the entrance. That's when we noticed the doors, which had been open when we came in, were now closed. I tried pushing them, but they wouldn't budge. It was like they'd been locked by someone, or something. The music started getting louder, and the echo inside the church made it feel like the choir was all around us. Anna came running back down from the altar, her eyes wide, and said there was no one up there. Julia tried to stay calm, but I could see her shaking. Peter went to the doors and tried forcing them open with all his strength, but they didn't move an inch. Then, the music stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was worse. We just stared at each other, unsure of what to do, until Anna pointed at something behind me. When I turned around, I saw one of the hymnals on the floor was open, like someone had just used it. Julia was the first to move. She walked over to the hymnal and looked at the open page. It was a hymn we didn't recognize, with old-fashioned lyrics about finding the light at the end of the darkness. She read it out loud in a low voice, and we all fell silent, as if it meant something. That's when the music started again, but this time it was louder, more intense. You could hear distinct voices, like there was actually a choir singing inside. Anna tried covering her ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside her head. Peter shouted for us to try forcing the doors together, and we ran over, but they still wouldn't budge, like they'd been sealed shut. That's when the lights started to change. The high windows of the church, which had been letting in sunlight, seemed to be darkening, like a storm was rolling in. But when I looked outside through a crack, the sky was still clear. Julia started crying, saying she wanted to leave, and I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The music kept going, and now you could hear clear words, "Fear not, for the light is with you." It was beautiful, but at the same time terrifying, because we knew there was no one there to sing it. Anna, desperate, started screaming for help, but the sound of the choir seemed to drown out her voice. Peter, who's always been the most rational, tried to find another way out, but all the side doors were locked, and the windows were too high to reach. Julia, still crying, clung to me, and I tried to think of something, anything, to get us out of there. That's when the light inside the church changed again. The candles on the altar, which had been extinguished and covered in dust, lit up on their own, one by one. The flames were weak, but you could see them clearly. The music stopped again, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then, something cracked behind us. We all turned at the same time and saw one of the pews, which had been overturned, had righted itself on its own. Anna let out a muffled scream, and Peter froze. I felt a chill run down my spine, like someone was watching us, but there was no one there. Julia whispered, "We need to get out of here now," and I agreed, but there was no way out. That's when the music started again, this time softer, almost like a whisper. You could hear the words clearly, "The door is open." We looked back, and the main doors, which had been locked, were now slightly ajar, like someone had just opened them. We didn't think twice. We bolted out of the church, almost tripping over each other, and didn't stop until we were a good distance away. When I looked back, the church seemed normal again, like nothing had happened. The doors were closed, and there was no more sound. Peter tried to say it was all in our heads, but the look on his face said otherwise. Julia was still shaking, and Anna stayed quiet for the rest of the day. We never talked about what happened there, but whenever I pass by that field, I get that chill down my spine. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced in that church. I've tried researching the place, but I haven't found anything. It's like it doesn't exist in any records. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear that faint music, like a distant echo. And whenever it happens, I remember the words of the hymn, "Fear not, for the light is with you." But honestly, I don't know if that was a warning or a curse. All I know is I'll never forget that day, and I'll never step foot in an abandoned church again. We were on a road trip, driving through that part of the highway where there's nothing for miles, just trees and asphalt. The sun was already setting, and we needed to stop to stretch our legs. That's when we saw the abandoned gas station. It looked like it had come straight out of a horror movie, the sign all rusted, the gas pumps covered in spiderwebs, and weeds growing everywhere. Luke, who's always been the most adventurous in the group, insisted we check it out. I wasn't really into it, but Karen and Peter agreed with him, so I gave in. Little did we know what we were about to find inside. When we walked into the little convenience store, the smell of mold was so strong you could almost taste it in the air. The shelves were empty, except for a few old bags of chips and some dented soda cans. On the floor, there were scattered papers, like old receipts, and a notebook on the counter. Peter picked up the notebook and started flipping through it. It was a diary, written by a trucker who seemed to have spent some time there. The first few pages talked about normal stuff, like gas prices and the heat, but as we kept reading, the entries got weirder. He wrote about noises at night, shadows moving in the dark, and a constant feeling of being watched. We were so absorbed in reading that we almost didn't notice the sound. Karen was the first to hear it, the sound of a car pulling up, like someone had stopped right outside. We looked at each other, half in disbelief, because no one had driven by for hours. Luke went to the window and looked out, but there was nothing there. Just the abandoned gas station and the empty road. Karen said it must have been the wind, but I wasn't convinced. The sound had been too clear, like a car had stopped right in front of the store. That's when Peter read the last entry in the diary out loud. The handwriting was shaky, like the guy had written it in a hurry. "They're still here, waiting." We all fell silent, and the air seemed to get heavier. Luke tried to crack a joke, but his voice faltered. Karen suggested we get out of there, and I agreed. But as we turned to leave, we heard the sound again. This time, it was like a car was backing up, but when we looked out the window, there was still nothing there. Peter closed the diary and put it back on the counter, but I swear I saw his hands trembling. We decided to get out of there as fast as we could, but Luke insisted on taking one last look around the station, just to make sure there wasn't anything else weird. While he and Peter went to the back of the store, Karen and I stayed near the door, keeping an eye on the parking lot. That's when we heard a noise coming from behind the shelves, like something had been knocked over. Karen jumped and grabbed my arm, but I tried to stay calm. Luke and Peter came running back, their eyes wide, and said they'd seen something moving in the dark. Something that didn't seem human. We bolted out of the station, almost tripping over each other, and got into the car. Luke started the engine right away, and we sped off like crazy. I looked in the rearview mirror as we drove away, and I swear I saw a shadow standing in the doorway of the station, like it was watching us. Karen refused to look, and Peter stayed silent for the rest of the trip. When we got to the nearest town, we stopped at a diner to calm down, but no one said much. It was like we were afraid to talk about what had happened, as if mentioning it would bring whatever it was back. After that night, things were never the same. Luke started saying he heard strange noises at home, like someone walking around in the backyard, but when he looked, there was never anything there. Karen kept dreaming about the gas station every night, waking up screaming, saying she'd seen something in her room. Peter, who's always been the skeptic, started carrying a knife with him, just in case. And me. I can't forget that last line from the diary, "They're still here, waiting." Sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel like I'm being watched, even though there's no one around. We never talked about the gas station again, and we never went back to that road. But to this day, I wonder what we brought back with us. The trucker's diary didn't explain who they were or what they were waiting for. And honestly, I don't know if I want to find out. All I know is that, since that night, we've never been the same. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I still hear the sound of a car pulling up, even though there's no one there.